Hello and welcome to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Brock Mildon from Brock's Kit Closet. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, good. I'm glad to be on and glad to talk a little bit more.
And we're going to be talking about some really unknown aspects of football history that I'm really excited about. But before we get into that and kick things off, Brock, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your involvement with football, teams you support, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Brock. I'm from Utah in the US, out west, born and raised. I grew up, I would say, just as a normal American boy. Grew up playing baseball and basketball. I played 1 year of soccer when I was maybe in first grade, second grade. Hated it, hated all of it. I didn't know what I was doing, so the coach put me in defense, and that was boring, and I didn't have anything to do. So I quit after 1 year, and I would follow like the World Cup a little bit here and there. But when I was 19, 20 years old, I moved away to Germany for 2 years, and that's where I really fell in love with the sport. Was there for the World Cup, for the Euros, and it was just amazing. And I just fell in love with it. And ever since then, I've just wanted to surround myself as much as I could with football and learn. And so yeah, I support Real Salt Lake. That's the MLS team here. But there's loads of other lower leagues and teams and colleges here in Utah that play, and I try to support everyone I can. And I work for a couple teams here doing some things, but that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. I love all of that. And what a place to learn and to get acquainted with football of all places. Germany, it's one of the best places you could have possibly went. Not that we're all not surrounded by great football and soccer teams when we go to look for them, but for someone who wasn't really enjoying the sport and didn't have a great experience with it, to then go to Germany and just be like, oh yeah, this is actually great. It's so brilliant. And I just absolutely love the story and your work with other clubs around you as well. But you're also a avid kit collector, aren't you? And that's what your Twitter page is all about, isn't it? Brock's Kit Closet.
Yeah, definitely. I would say during COVID, when a lot of people were home and not working and bored, that's kind of when I got into that. And my wife probably isn't too happy about that, but she's really good and supportive. And to be honest, that's when I started getting more into the history of soccer here in Utah as well. I found some great articles, and that kind of started my yearning for the history here in Utah and uncovering and learning more about it.
Mm. Yeah, COVID was one of those times when everyone sort of started got more time to research and dig into these things. I mean, I'd say probably COVID was around the time that I started collecting kits as well, in the loosest possible sense. Like I had time in my hands, I had a bit more money than I normally would have, so I just started buying every single Celtic kit that I possibly could, and started my own little collection. So quite amazing. And as you mentioned, the soccer history of Utah was one of these things that you started delving into more, and that's really going to be what we're talking about today. We've done episodes on clubs from the former clubs from the MLS before, of course, Shiva USA. We've spoken before about the NASL. We spoke about Galt FC in Canada and the different things. But today we really wanted to kind of go more niche and go down one of the state routes. And it's a state that doesn't really get a lot of attention when it comes to soccer. But I think that's what makes it all the more interesting because this type of history and this type of information, there's surely only a handful of people out there that know about it. I mean, it's just so niche, but that's what makes it so great. And we're going to be talking about it through a couple of different mediums, Brock. We're going to be discussing the Danes Cup. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. That's what I have focused most of my research on, but we can talk about other things as well.
hmm Yeah, I think we'll definitely talk about other things too. From what you've said to me, it sounds like that the history of soccer in Utah can really be talked about through the Danes Cup. Would it be right in saying that?
Yeah, I think that's a correct assumption. It started in the early 1900s, and for quite a while, a few decades, it was the championship. It was the state championship. Um, so teams would compete, and whoever won that would be the state champion. And so that's why it was so significant in those early years.
Brilliant. I love cup competitions like that and just the really cool rules that they have around them as well. So I suppose that's something that we'll maybe come on to speak to later on when the Daynes Cup kind of comes about. But to kick things off, why don't you take us right back to the start, to the founding of soccer in Utah and the kind of early pioneering clubs, if you like, that really brought the sport over there.
Yeah, I absolutely. I love that you used the word pioneer because that plays a big focus in this story. So for you, I don't know who knows too much about the history of Utah as a state to begin with, but the state was founded upon what we call our pioneers. They were a group, a religious group, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. But they were back east in Illinois and places, and they were having real persecution a lot. So they wanted to get away from that. They wanted religious freedom. So they came to Utah looking for freedom. They settled here in Utah in the 1800s, and at the time, this area was part of Mexico. So they left the United States for that religious freedom. And they settled here in Utah in 1847 is when they first arrived. So during that time, there was lots of members of the church that were coming over. They had a big missionary force in England and Great Britain. So people were coming over from there. And so I think people coming from Great Britain and also a large amount of people coming from Scandinavia, Norway, and such, I think they brought football with them. I think that's how it started. Something that was very interesting to me when I started researching is I learned that soccer was first officially introduced to Utah in 1882. Now, the funny thing with that,
Perhaps even Scotland as well would have brought football over to yourselves because, of course, there's still a lot of migration going on from Europe to the Americas at this point. There's still a lot of migration going on there, so it's quite interesting, and I like how there's that kind of historic context to it as well. Because if you keep up with our Twitter page, then you'll see that we often interact with this group of people from Scotland called the Scotch Professors, who they've kind of made it their aim to, I suppose, educate people on the role that Scottish footballing pioneers played in kind of spreading football across the world. Because when you look at it, it's actually huge. You know, the very first person who founded a football team in Argentina was a Scottish guy, and you know he found this club. He founded the Argentinian League. You know, there's so many aspects to it, and I just think it's really really fascinating how this historic context plays into it. And again, it's brilliant how even before football comes to Brazil, it's being played in Utah, and it's fantastic. And you know as you said there, the first sort of recorded instance of it is in 1882. I mean, I'm assuming it wasn't in any sense professional. Was it just a group of people having a kickabout, two named teams, or did the teams even have names? Is there any indication of that at all?
there's it's very hard researching all that far back. But from what I can tell, those early years, the first, let's say, 2 decades until the 1900s, those first 20 years are mostly played by uh, congregations of the church. They would have their own teams, they would play against other neighborhoods, other congregations of the church. So they kind of had um, an interesting, they were friendly, and they were all members mostly of the church that was here, but they still wanted to win. They wanted to compete, but they were not professional. It was for recreation. It was to forget about the hard labor that they were doing, about settling. You talked about frontiersmen, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's just really, really. I love hearing these stories, man. I love hearing where the names came from and who the people were involved in them and things like that. So, 1882 is the first instance of football being played in Utah. What's the next sort of milestone? What's the next sort of big event that happens from there? Did it spread? Did other different groups of pioneers and other settlers decide to pick up balls and start playing themselves, or was it a bit more of a slow burner?
I think it was surprisingly fast from what I've researched. So the next big milestone I would have to say would be 1906. So that's about 20, 25 years later. And that was when the Danes Cup began. That was the first year of the Danes Cup. And immediately from the very beginning, it was known as the state tournament. So the Danes Challenge Cup was organized by a jeweler in Salt Lake City. He created the Danes Cup to resemble the original FA Cup in England. So it looked identical to the original FA Cup in England. And different teams would play, and it was up until World War II that it was known as the State Cup. And so after that, it continued to go on, but it no longer was the de facto state championship. So in those early years, it was very interesting because you had two um, teams that would basically, you had lots of teams, but there were two perennials that would win it. Um, the team that won it the very first year in 1906 was known as Salt Lake or Salt Lake AFC. And they won it in 1906. And then in the second year was a team called Eureka. Now, Eureka was a mining town, and it was out west in the desert from Salt Lake in this mining area. And so lots of people came to work in these mines from all over, from England, from Scotland. Now, the interesting thing is the Salt Lake team from the big city, they had all of the prosperity, they had wealth, they were able to play on the weekends. But the team from Eureka were more hard-nosed, tough workers, mines, that kind of thing. And so it was really interesting to me to see the difference between these two teams. Um, but they were so heavily contested that the Danes Cup winner would switch hands between these two teams back and forth for several years.
It's just I absolutely love it, man, because from what you've just said, you're literally seeing these teams and the birth of their identities, and it's like a derby, do you know what I mean? And this team, you know, they're able to play in the weekends, and they come from this background, and this other team, they're the miners, and they're a lot more hardworking, and it's brilliant stuff, man. It's great, and you can really get a sense of. I mean, I'm assuming right that these teams unfortunately aren't around anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct. It's hard going through the records because these teams were just simply known as like the team from this, like the name of the city, so Salt Lake.
Mhm.
But it's hard to tell, okay, which team is Salt Lake, which team is another Salt Lake team. Did they merge? Did they start fresh? So the records are really murky there.
Mhm. Yeah, frustrating, but it's a shame because if they had survived to now, then you could imagine they'd be contesting this really fierce derby and stuff, and it would be great. But it's absolutely incredible. And just to go back to something else that you'd said as well, I love how the Danes Cup was modelled after the original FA Cup in England as well. Is the Danes Cup, just to kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent for now, is the Danes Cup a trophy that's still contested in Utah at the moment?
Yes, it is. It's still played every year. I believe this was the 102nd this last fall, I believe was the 102nd Danes Cup. So it has gone ever since it began in 1906. It did have a period where they didn't play for, I want to say, maybe 3 years during World War One, and then there was a large span during World War Two where they didn't play for about 10 years. And then they didn't play in 2020 because of COVID. But besides those three instances, it's gone on every year.
Brilliant. Because I wanted to ask just to draw comparisons, you know, to the FA Cup and the Scottish Cup as well, because they're two of the oldest trophies in the world. And I can imagine, to be fair, that the majority of football associations, when they founded their domestic cup, as we would know it now, they're probably still being played. But over here in Scotland, before, well, you had the Scottish Cup and then you had the Scottish League. And in amongst all this, you also had regional trophies. So you had the Aberdeenshire Cup, which is still contested, the Lanarkshire Cup, Renfrewshire Cup, etc., etc. And many of those don't exist anymore, or they only exist at an amateur or a junior level, which is a shame because at one point in time there were really, really strongly contested trophies and really like big. things to get in your trophy cabinet at the end of the season, you know. So it's just great to hear that something as historic as this is still being contested. It's got that longevity behind it as well. But back to the kind of more historic side of things, of course, with Utah sort of not being isolated, I don't think that's fair to say, but you know, it's not from the west, it's not from the east, it's in the Midwest, which is pretty sparsely populated, can be really, really remote areas at the best of times. Did Utah really follow the trend of soccer in America at this time in the rest of the country where leagues were being formed, or did it take it a little while to kind of get off the mark with that?
Yeah, I think they were teams and leagues were sprouting up all over. So Utah is in the west. To our west is Nevada, and to the west of Nevada is California. So we are considered in the west, like you said, where places are few and far between. It was really fun. A little bit of a side tangent. This last season when Real Salt Lake played in the U.S. Open Cup, we got to play at Las Vegas for our first game. And we thought that that was great that we only had to drive 8 hours to the nearest place, where back east and in Europe, that's so far away, right? But out here west, where it is less populated and farther between, I think it was hard for teams to exist. And I think that's why there's a lot of teams that came and got and went. But something else that I found interesting was up until about World War II, there was a lot of sources that said soccer in Utah was just as popular as baseball, which is crazy to me because baseball here is known as America's pastime. It's the historic sport everybody plays. That's what I grew up playing. But it wasn't until World War II where soccer began to decline here.
Wow, that's amazing. So let's have a little bit of what if, right? Let's have a little bit of conjecture, just so that we can think about it, because I find that concept really interesting. As you said, baseball is America's pastime. I don't, is it the national sport? Is that American football? Is it still baseball?
I believe it's still considered baseball, yeah.
Okay. So to think that soccer in Utah was as popular, if not more popular than baseball at that period of time is really, really fascinating to me. Why do you think that was? Was it possibly to do with the religious connection? Maybe I don't know. I'm not you know, from what I know about the history of Utah, and again, this is just from really, really basic history lessons in school. Obviously, there is the religious aspect to it, which we get taught about, but you know, it seems like one of those kind of phenomenon situations, and I don't know, I just don't know if you had any thoughts on why that might have been. It's quite interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it definitely the religion has a part to play in it. Like I said, there were so many people, immigrants coming for religious purposes here. I want to say it was something like 500,000 people immigrated to Utah between around the time of World War II. I think America started taking a real look inside, and I think maybe there was some prejudice, there was some racism, and they said, okay, you guys are from Europe. You guys play soccer. We're American. We're going to play baseball. I think that's where the decline started to happen in soccer.
Yeah, it would be a really good research point. From what I know, just based on other sort of historic events in other contexts, I think you're on the mark there. I think it would have a lot to do with the sort of domestic American reaction to World War II and other factors kind of playing into that. So soccer kind of takes a bit of a nosedive, and then of course going into the 50s and 60s, we're really starting to kind of get into the NASL era, aren't we? And for a lot of people looking back on football in America, soccer in America, sorry, that's really what they look at. I mean, the Caribous of Colorado potentially have one of the best kits that I've ever seen in my entire life. You had the San Jose Earthquakes, you had the LA Aztecs, all these iconic names that so many people know and love. And yeah, this was one of the eras that I was most excited to get into.
Yeah, that was definitely, we call it the heyday of American soccer, right? You had Pele, you had Beckenbauer, you had George Best, all of these iconic superstars came over to more or less finish their careers here in the States. And it was the New York Cosmos played, they would sell it out. I'm not sure exactly how what the capacity was, but 60, 70,000, and they would sell it out to see Pele.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, it's a kind of eye iconism, I don't think that's a word, but you know what I mean with it, the different logos that the teams would have, players that played with them, just all these things. Of course, Jimmy Johnson, one of Celtic's greatest ever players, played for San Jose Earthquakes. Don't know if he maybe played for another NASL team as well, but he definitely played for the Earthquakes. It's quite crazy, but it's brilliant, and it's something that a lot of people look back on quite fondly. Are there any NASL teams from Utah? Any that really come to mind? Any that sort of pulled up trees, set the heather alight at all during this period of time?
I don't believe there were any that played in the NASL, but we did have some professional or semi-professional teams. Mostly they didn't start coming to Utah till about the 70s, I would say. So the first big team in the 70s, they were called the Utah Golden Spikers. The term Golden Spike comes from when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in Utah, and they used a golden spike to commemorate the railroad, the East Coast, all the way through the U.S. to the West Coast. But they really didn't start till about the 70s. And then they only played a couple years, and then they kind of fell away. And then there was like another team in the 80s called the Salt Lake Sting. So there have been teams that have come and gone, but I feel like it's pretty much the same story with most NASL teams that happen. So of course you have those big iconic teams that you mentioned, but there were not quite hundreds, but there were dozens of teams that they just couldn't do it for whatever reason. They didn't have the popularity, they didn't have the funds, and so they would come and go just like that.
Spoken about on other episodes, and from what we've saw, it is a big mix of the things that you've just mentioned. There's a lot of money involved for a start. They're bringing all of these players over from Europe, which must have led to so many financial problems, having to pay these guys and things like that. But it's also trying to kind of launch soccer in America almost when it doesn't all really have a following already. And this is when you start getting the franchise thing coming in, and yeah, it must have been really difficult. And I suppose that's part of the appeal of all these clubs, is that they existed for such short a time, but they stick out in people's minds, especially of a certain generation, because that's what they would have seen and what they would have consumed from soccer in America. So obviously the NASL's going on at this time, and eventually the MLS would come around, and of course you have Real Salt Lake now. But I suppose kind of going back to the roots a little bit, going back to those first kind of two teams and the teams that we mentioned, the minors and the other group of guys. There's obviously going to be so many other football teams and soccer teams playing in Utah at this point in time, just outside the NASL, and kind of a more grassroots manner, I suppose. Maybe playing for different things at a kind of amateur level. I know it's all a little bit messy, but have you come across any clubs at all that done that in Utah? Maybe still contesting the Daynes Cup at all? Is that maybe a good medium to look at this through?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously there weren't really any professional teams that I know of. There were some where some would pay their players, some would pay. But going back to those early years, how I talked about Salt Lake AFC, they were known to, they recruited a player from Scotland. His name was Alex McWhirter, and he came over, and I don't know if it's official, but he's known to be the first professional soccer player in Utah. And like I said, they won the Danes Cup in 1906. They won it again in 1908, and then again in 1910. Going back to that rivalry between Salt Lake and Eureka, Salt Lake was mostly made up of Scottish players, whereas Eureka was made up of mostly players from England, and so that was another level to the rivalry there between England and Scotland. Um, as we go a little bit more through the years in the 1920s, I want to say maybe I forget the date exactly, 1921 or it might have been 1922. There was a team called Vikings that was founded, and they were, of course, founded from players that were from Scandinavia, Norway mostly. And they had a famous player on their team. His name was Alf Engen, and he ended up, so he played a few years, and then he ended up mostly switching over to skiing. He was Norwegian, and he became a world champion skier, and he set lots of world records. There's a huge monument and museum for him here in Park City, which was one of the big areas that helped host the 2002 Winter Olympics in Utah. And so I found that was fascinating. And that team still exists. Vikings, they are the oldest surviving team in Utah, and they were founded in 1922, and they're still contesting the Danes Cup 100 years later. It's crazy.
Vikings have been playing since 1922. They are still around. There's statues, there's museums and things like that. Would you say that the history of soccer in Utah is quite well promoted and protected internally? No, is it something that maybe there needs to be a little bit more work done in terms of getting it out there?
Absolutely. And that was the main reason why I wanted to come on your show, is just to get more recognition. I feel like today with Real Salt Lake and other, successful soccer teams here, there are a lot of passionate fans, and the sport really is growing here. But I feel like not very many people know about the history. And like you said, the history is so rich. And so that was the biggest reason why I wanted to come on, was just to get that recognition out there, and to show people that, we do have great teams now, but we had great teams 100 years ago, that history is so rich.
Definitely, it is really rich. And from what you've told me today, I mean, just found out so much from what you said. I had no idea that there was a large Scottish population in Salt Lake City for a start. I had no idea that one of the football teams that started there was mainly made up of Scottish people. Like it's fascinating hearing all these things, and you're talking about literally like spanning so many eras. You're going from the pioneers to more migration and then into World War II almost, and it just goes so quickly, and it's just so brilliant hearing about it. But for now, I actually wanted to ask a little bit more about the Danes Cup because I'm quite fascinated in it, and I'm quite fascinated in sort of state-centric or nationwide tournaments which take place underneath the MLS. And I'm quite interested just in how it works because all we're really exposed to is the MLS. And I do follow a couple of NASL teams, Detroit City being one of them, follow them, and a couple of other sort of grassroots teams as well. But outside of that, I'm not too familiar with how the setup works. So why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like you said, there's MLS, which is considered, the top tier. And obviously, as you know, there's no promotion relegation here, which a lot of people are fighting for. But then after that, there's USL Championship, which is the second division. Then the third division kind of splits into some different leagues. USL League One, NISA, I believe, and then MLS Next Pro are all third division. And it's only the top three divisions that are officially defined by U.S. soccer. After that, it gets kind of murky. So Division Four, you would say, is like USL League Two, which is more of a college summer league, and then there's like UPSL or NPSL, some different amateur leagues. So you have the MLS, you have all of those leagues playing their own championships, their own competitions. But then we have the U.S. Open Cup, which I believe began in 1914. So the Danes Cup in Utah is actually like 7, 8 years older than the U.S. Open Cup. And then, yeah, you can find other different regional cups. I know, like in Baltimore, there's some really big local competitions. In Maryland and back east. Mostly there's not a whole lot out west. And so that's why I find the Danes Cup so fascinating. Currently, it's more of a, I guess you would say, Sunday league, a rec league. They're all amateur, which I understand it because of, RSL is the big team here. But it's just a little sad to me seeing the history that it once was to what it's kind of become now, how far it's fallen.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what I was going to ask next was how the Danes Cup kind of worked in terms of the team selection now, but is it just the case that it's a league and that it's mainly made up of amateur teams, yeah?
Yeah, so there is a league hosted by the Utah Soccer Association or the Utah Adult Soccer Association, and they have different rec leagues, different divisions, and inside their organization, they have promotion relegation, but so they have their own leagues. But then the Daynes Cup is kind of a separate cup tournament, which is, I believe, only contested by the top premier league of the Utah Soccer Association.
Right, I see. I see. Yeah, because that's what I was going to ask about. That's what I was quite curious about was if it was like all teams from Utah, like kind of like the Scottish Cup where it's a round robin and all teams are involved in it, and Real Salt Lake would be in it and stuff like that as well. But it's still quite interesting how it works, and I like as well that you mentioned that it's older than the US Open Cup as well, because again, it's something that's just really interesting. All these historic trophies, they kind of get brushed under the radar when you're talking about things like that. So it's just really, really fascinating hearing about them. And of course, RSL are probably the Utah's team, I guess, within MLS. I mean, can you see another team from Utah making the breakthrough into the MLS anytime soon, do you think? I know there's a lot involved in that in terms of giving up franchise rights and things like that, but what do you think? Any chance of it happening in the near future?
Definitely not in terms of MLS. Just Utah is one of the smaller states population wise. So we're really lucky to have an MLS team to begin with. A few years ago, Real Salt Lake's second team, the reserve team, the Real Monarchs, they were in the USL Championship, which was the second division. But a couple years ago, MLS decided to pull out of the USL and they began their own reserve league, the MLS Next Pro. I want to say, depending on the year, it kind of fluctuates every year, but we have anywhere from two, three, four teams competing in the USL 2, which is technically like the fourth division. It's a college summer league. And then we have loads of UPSL teams, another amateur league. And then we have college soccer here. Women's college soccer is really big in Utah. There's some really good programs like BYU, Brigham Young University, and they're one of the top teams in the nation when it comes to women's soccer. In terms of like men's soccer, however, there's only a couple universities here that have men's soccer just because of different laws. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but there was a law that was passed, I want to say back in like the 70s. It was called Title 9, and that made it um, you had to offer the same amount of scholarships to men and women. So because of that, there's not very many college men's soccer teams because a lot focus on football, American football, and so they give a lot more scholarships to that. But there are a couple men's soccer teams, college, Utah Valley University, and they're actually coached by Kyle Beckerman, who played for Real Salt Lake. He's a legend here. And then we have a couple other smaller ones, Westminster, Salt Lake Community College, and such. But
Hopefully, and with any luck, people from Utah will be listening to this and they can maybe go out and support the local team or dig into some more history of soccer in the state that they're from. And it's just really, really, really fascinating to hear all this and to be able to speak about it as well. One thing that I did want to ask and kind of if there was any stories or any kind of, trivia things from the history of soccer in Utah that come to your mind as being your favorite, maybe something that not a lot of people would know about, just a great story that you've come across, anything along those lines.
I would have to say just that one that I mentioned earlier about that Norwegian who ended up becoming a world-class skier. I find that fascinating because Utah is also known for having, we say, the greatest snow on earth. The Olympics, the Winter Olympics were held here. We're hoping to get the Winter Olympics back, but I feel like that's a great story. There was another one that's maybe not so positive, but that Scotsman that I mentioned earlier from Salt Lake, I was just recently looking through some old newspapers on a database, and I found that he was arrested for having an unclean bakery, which I found interesting. And he was arrested later for gambling. So there are some fascinating stories as you get into it, but yeah, I think that the one with the Vikings player, another one that comes to mind is in the 50s there was a man, I'm forgetting his name now. Let me look here. Arthur Zander. He was German. He was from Hamburg, and he immigrated to Utah for religious purposes. But then he was the one that kind of started up high school soccer in the 50s here in Utah, and up until his death, maybe a decade ago, maybe in the early 2000s, he would sell soccer equipment out of his house, out of his basement, because especially in those early years in the 50s and the 60s, you couldn't go down just to your local sporting goods store and find soccer cleats, boots, shin guards, any of that kind of stuff. So he's one of the ones that is in the Utah Soccer Hall of Fame for his work in the sport.
That's a brilliant story. I love these kind of things that people who go over and they found these things that are kind of staples of how our game is today and how they make up the sort of grassroots elements of it. The people who started these things because they're so often forgotten for, the greats and the stars and the best players and this kind of thing, which is great in itself. But, these people need remembering and they're worth remembering as well for the impact they had on soccer in any given place. And yeah, just there's so many great stories from that and how these people are commemorated. But again, as you said, it's something that still maybe needs a little bit of promotion and something that needs to be protected and championed maybe a little bit more. And listen, Brock, if you're the man to do that, then that's absolutely fine with me because some of the stuff that you've told me tonight has been absolutely fascinating and really, really great knowledge. So I do hope a lot of our listeners go and look it up some more because it sounds like it's great stuff. And from what you said, I've been there myself, digging through archives and newspapers online and just going down rabbit holes and finding something else and just taking a note of it. It's really great and it can be really, really rewarding as well when you think you've found this little nugget of information that not everyone might know about. Um, I'm assuming then, well, I assume, and to be fair, I assume a lot, you're a RSL fan, or do you support a team that's more local to you, or, a little bit more grassroots?
And so because of that, because they've been so successful, they've qualified for the last two US Open Cups, and they've played the first round of the US Open Cup the last 2 years. So I just want to say that yeah, of course, there's Real Salt Lake, there's the big team here, but there are lots of local teams, whether that's these USL League Two teams, whether there's some UPSL teams, there's college soccer. There's a lot to support, and the local teams here need support. Their biggest need is funding, is support, is recognition.
Absolutely. I think that goes without saying that any clubs that are maybe a little bit further down the tiers as you go, the thing that they rely on most is support, recognition, match day gate receipts, people buying merchandise, people buying food when they're at the games. So get out and support your local if you're able to. I think that's absolutely terrific advice that people should follow everywhere. But I like as well how you said, all of the above. It's very much a Utah thing and I get that that's something that's a little bit different in the US and Canada with states and things like that and elsewhere. So yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And apart from the clubs that you've mentioned, do you have any football kits in your collection of clubs from Utah? Do you tend to just stick to the ones that you know? Any historic kits at all, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I have a 1998 Tampa Bay Mutiny from the old MLS, an old I want to say maybe the same year, 98 or 99 New York Metro Stars. I do have I want to say 2009 Chivas USA. So right now I'm kind of focusing on collecting MLS. I want to collect one from every MLS team and also one from every Bundesliga team. So that's kind of where my focus lies. But I do have some local kits as well. BYU Cougars, the university here. I have a Utah Red Wolves. There's another independent team, Utah Clutch. They play in the Mountain Premier League. It's an independent league. But I collect from all over. I'm a Dortmund supporter. I do support Celtic when it comes to Scotland. So I feel like just like most fans, you kind of have a team for every league or country, but I tend to focus on MLS and the Bundesliga.
Brilliant. Yeah, I've also got a Shiva USA away kit. I can't remember when it's from though. It's got a collar. I remember that much, but I can't remember the year. So I'll need to go back and have a look. But it's a beautiful kit. And just from what you said there, I don't know who my MLS team would be. If I'm being honest, I've often thought about it. But I mean, I have some family that live in New Jersey. I've got some friends in Ohio, but so probably Columbus actually. Columbus Crew would probably be my MLS team just by default if I was to pick one. So yeah, but man, it's just it's great what you do in terms of the historical research and digging up all this archived information, bringing it to people and through your own kit collection as well. You must have some fascinating kits in there, so we will definitely need to get you back on for an episode to talk about that with some other kit collectors because it's something we've wanted to do for a while, the historic ones. Wonder if you could tell me how much an old Caribous of Colorado top would cost, if any ever get put out in circulation. I could imagine it's maybe like an auction type situation with those.
Yeah, the last I heard about those, there were some that were popping up on eBay a couple years ago for a couple grand. But the last that I had heard about the Caribou was that the owner, they only played 1 year and then they disbanded. Last I had heard was that their owner took all of the kits himself, and there were not any others made, just the ones for the team, that he took back after the team folded. So I was really curious when I started seeing some pop up on eBay a couple years ago. I don't know if those are original or maybe fakes. But the last I had heard was that the owner, who's still alive, has all of them in his mountain ranch lodge in Colorado. So I don't know the exact story on that. There was a few years ago, the Colorado Rapids in the MLS, they had posted that their new kits for the year were going to be those original Caribou Colorado jerseys, but it turns out that they posted that on April Fool's Day, so it was just a joke, um, sadly. But I'm with you. I would love to get my hands on one of those.
Yeah, very upsetting to hear that, but I guess maybe going back to the owner sitting in that big stack of jerseys, maybe he just kind of throws a couple up on eBay whenever he's running out of money. And that just keeps him going for a couple of months or something. That's what maybe it sounds like. Love to get my hands on one, but unfortunately, I don't think I could justify that at the moment, but you never know. Um, Brock, it's been a fascinating episode. It's been great to chat with you about all things soccer history in Utah. Is there anything else that you want to add or that you want to ask me just before we finish things up for tonight?
Yeah, I would just like to add, like I said earlier, that wherever you may be, I think it's important to get out and support your local clubs. Um, it's a lot cheaper, than the top levels of the Premier League or MLS. And they really need it. They really need your support. Um, and I think football is football. And whether that's the lowest division or the highest, football is football. And some say that the lower divisions is maybe more pure, maybe more what football is all about. So whatever team is in your area, whether that is an MLS team or a low division, I say if you're a fan of the game, I think you should go out and support whoever you can.
I think that's great advice, and I can absolutely echo that sentiment. I think it's really, really important that you find your local team, whether it's amateur in Scotland, whether it's junior, amateur, West of Scotland, East of Scotland League, whoever they might be. Go out and support them. Even some clubs in League Two in the Highland and Lowland League, go out and support your local club, particularly if they're a community-run club and a community-centric initiative or something set up to help the community because they're doing it and they're raising this money so that they can help you guys and bring you guys something as well. So I think that's a great sentiment to end the episode on. Of course, you can also check out all of Brock's collection at Brock's Kit Closet on Twitter. Literally just that. That's all you need to go and search. can keep up to date with that. And he also posts up the odd bit of knowledge and bit of information and story from the history of soccer in Utah. So if you've enjoyed this, that's where you can go and find that out. And I'm sure he wouldn't mind anyone reaching out to him if they have any questions or if they want to find something out in that. And of course, if there's a subject or topic related to football history or heritage that you want us to cover, whether that's football culture, identity, the history of a club, forgotten competitions like the one we've spoken about today, then please do get in touch. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Please also check out our website, footballheritage.co.uk, which is where all of our fantastic written content goes up from our wonderful contributors. But for now, Brock, say goodbye.
Good night. Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure coming on.
It was a pleasure having you on as well, mate. So goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.